can't take advantage of someone and not expect to get consequences.
As we all know, life in prison is a brutal fight for survival, where only the most ruthless endure. For killers who once terrorized the outside world, the story often changes behind bars. Many fear how their fellow inmates will react to their heinous crimes, creating an ironic twist where those who once dealt out violence now face judgment, and sometimes death, at the hands of other prisoners. Join us as we explore 10 dangerous killers who met a brutal end in prison. Number 1. Albert DeSalvo. And last on the list of dangerous killers who met a brutal end in prison, we have Albert DeSalvo. In the early 1960s, fear gripped the Boston area. Between 1962 and 1964, a string of brutal murders took place, all carried out by a mysterious figure who would later be known as the Boston Strangler. The victims were all single women, ranging from 19 to 85 years old. They were found in their homes, sexually assaulted and strangled with ropes, stockings, or cords. Despite intense efforts by police and detectives, the killer remained at large. Enter Albert DeSalvo, a man with a troubled past. Born in Chelsea, Massachusetts in 1931, DeSalvo grew up in a home filled with violence. His father was abusive, often beating his wife and children. Young Albert was no stranger to the streets and soon found himself in trouble with the law. By his teens, he had been arrested for various petty crimes, setting the stage for a life marked by criminal activity. In March of 1965, DeSalvo, who was already in jail for other crimes, confessed to being the Boston Strangler. But there was a problem. No physical evidence linked him to the murders. As a result, he was never charged with the killings. Instead, in 1967, he was convicted of unrelated molestations and sentenced to life in prison. The question of whether DeSalvo was truly the Boston Strangler remained unanswered, with many doubting his confession. The story took a twist decades later. In July 2013, advances in DNA technology brought new life to the investigation. DNA from semen found on Mary Sullivan, the last known victim, was matched to DeSalvo's family through his nephew. This finding was strong enough to exclude nearly everyone else, leaving only a 1 in 1,000 chance that someone else was responsible. DeSalvo's body was exhumed, and the results confirmed the match. Despite his claims of being the notorious killer, DeSalvo's life ended in violence. In 1967, he managed to escape from Bridgewater State Hospital with 2 other inmates, leaving behind a note explaining that he wanted to shed light on poor conditions and his own mental health struggles. He evaded capture for 3 days before turning himself in through his lawyer. DeSalvo was then transferred to a maximum security prison in Walpole. On November 25, 1973, DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in the prison infirmary. The prime suspect was Robert Wilson, believed to be connected to the Winter Hill Gang. However, the trial ended in a hung jury, and Wilson walked free. Later, it was revealed that DeSalvo's murder may have been linked to his involvement in selling drugs at prices lower than those set by a prison syndicate, a decision that cost him his life. Number 2. Donald Harvey. Donald Harvey, known as the Angel of Death, was a figure of terror and deceit. Born in 1952 in Butler County, Ohio, Harvey's early life seemed ordinary, but darkness brewed beneath the surface. By the time he was 18, he had already begun a sinister career, starting as an orderly at Marymount Hospital in London, Kentucky. In 1970, Harvey's killing spree began. Over 10 months, he ended the lives of at least 12 patients, marking the beginning of a 17-year reign of terror. Working in hospitals across Ohio and Kentucky, Harvey targeted vulnerable patients, employing a variety of horrifying methods. His tools of death included arsenic and cyanide mixed into food or injected, insulin overdoses, suffocation, and even shutting down life support systems. He also contaminated IV fluids with hepatitis B and, in a particularly gruesome method, used a coat hanger to induce fatal abdominal punctures. For nearly 2 decades, Harvey concealed his crimes, but a tragic event in March of 1987 exposed him. John Powell, a patient on life support following a motorcycle accident, died under suspicious circumstances. An autopsy by Dr. Lee Lehman revealed the presence of cyanide in Powell's stomach. This discovery pointed to Harvey, especially after it was revealed he had been dismissed from the Cincinnati VA hospital for stealing body parts for occult rituals. During interrogation, Harvey confessed to killing Powell with cyanide, claiming it was an act of mercy. He chillingly admitted that had he not been caught, he would have continued his killing spree. "I felt what I was doing was right," Harvey said. "I was putting people out of their misery. I hope if I'm ever sick and full of tubes or on a respirator, someone will come and end it." In August of 1987, Harvey pleaded guilty to 24 murders, receiving 3 life sentences as part of a plea deal. Later, in November, he confessed to 9 additional murders, leading to an extra 20-year sentence to be served concurrently with his previous sentences. Harvey claimed his total number of victims might be as high as 50, although he was officially convicted of 37 murders. Harvey's life came to a violent end on March 28, 2017. He was found critically injured in his cell, the victim of a severe beating. 2 days later, on March 30th, he died from blunt force trauma. The final act of violence against the Angel of Death was carried out by fellow inmate James Elliott, who had taken it upon himself to end Harvey's life. Number 3. Leopold Dion. Leopold Dion, born in 1920, was destined for a life of darkness. His descent into infamy began at just 17, when he was convicted of gross indecency. In 1940, he joined the Canadian Army, but even the strict discipline of military life couldn't suppress his deviant urges. His time in service was marked by a shocking act, a failed attempt to take the life of a prostitute, an act for which he was inexplicably acquitted. The post-war years only deepened his sinister tendencies. Under the cover of night, Dion and his brother kidnapped a young woman. What followed was a night of horror, where they subjected her to unimaginable cruelty, stabbed her, and left her to die on railway tracks. But fate intervened. She survived and exposed the brothers' twisted minds. Leopold was handed a life sentence, while his brother faced 10 years behind bars. For 17 long years, Dion remained imprisoned. But when he was finally released on parole, no one knew the monster that had been set loose upon the world. By April of 1963, Dion's darkness emerged once again. Posing as a photographer, he began luring young boys into his deadly grasp. His first known victim was 12-year-old Guy Luckenock. What started as a promise of innocent photos ended in a secluded spot where Dion took the boy's life and buried him in a shallow grave. The horrors didn't stop there. On the 5th of May, 1963, Dion struck again. This time, his victims were 8-year-old Alain Carrier and 10-year-old Michel Morel, but Dion wasn't finished. On the 26th of May, 13-year-old Pierre Marquis fell into his deadly trap, meeting the same tragic fate as the others. Dion's murderous spree came to an end shortly after his last kill. Initially, he remained silent, but after a month of imprisonment, he crumbled under the weight of his guilt. He confessed to his vile crimes and led authorities to the graves of his victims, bringing a sliver of closure to the grieving families. On the 10th of April 1964, justice seemed within reach when Dion was sentenced to death by hanging. But fate intervened once again. Governor General George Vanier commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. However, Dion's story ended not by the hand of the state, but by a fellow inmate. On the 17th of November 1972, Norman Champagne, deluded into believing he was Lawrence of Arabia, plunged a makeshift blade into Dion, silencing the monster for good. Number 4. Thor Nis Christiansen. Santa Barbara in the late 70s was a time of innocence, a peaceful college town where students felt safe. But that peace was shattered when a dark shadow fell over the University of California at Santa Barbara. It started quietly, with the disappearance of Jacqueline Ann Rook, a 21-year-old student, who vanished from a bus stop in Goleta one late afternoon in 1976. The town whispered, but few were truly alarmed, until another student, Mary Saris, also 21, disappeared on the same day. Panic began to spread. As the new year rolled in, the fear deepened. In early 1977, Patricia Laney, another student of the same age, vanished under nearly identical circumstances. Their bodies were eventually found, abandoned in remote areas, each one a heartbreaking scene of violence. With a single fatal shot to the head, the town was gripped by terror. Who was targeting these women, and why did they all look so similar? For years, the community was haunted by these unanswered questions. Then, in 1979, a flicker of hope appeared. Lydia Preston, a young woman of 24, narrowly escaped death. Shot in the ear by a man who had offered her a ride, she somehow managed to escape. Wounded but determined, Lydia identified her attacker at a bar. Heinous Christiansen, a local man who had previously slipped under the radar, was arrested. The trial that followed in 1980 was a spectacle. Christiansen, initially pleading insanity, tried to escape the full weight of the law, but the evidence was clear, and the jury saw through his defense. He was found guilty of the murders and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. However, his story didn't end there. Less than a year into his sentence, on March 30th, 1981, Christiansen was stabbed to death in the prison yard. His killer was never caught, leaving the final chapter of his life as mysterious as the crimes that started it all. Number 5. Leroy Martin. Leroy Martin, born in 1937 in Gaffney, South Carolina, was a man shaped by a tough upbringing. His early life was filled with hardship and isolation. Growing up in a poor family in a small town, Leroy was often on the outside looking in. His father was harsh and demanding, expecting perfection, while his mother kept her distance, leaving Leroy to deal with his emotions alone. As a child, he would often wander the woods or sit by the river, lost in his own world. This isolation grew into a deep resentment, especially toward women. As an adult, Leroy's life didn't get any better. He drifted from one job to another, never staying in one place for long. People who knew him described him as quiet and unremarkable, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made others uncomfortable. No one could have guessed that this seemingly ordinary man would soon become the terror of Gaffney, South Carolina. It all started on a night in May, 1967. Annie Lucille Dedmond, after a night of drinking, left her husband Roger outside a donut shop. The next morning, her body was found on a highway between Union and Spindale, North Carolina. She had been strangled and molested. The police arrested Roger, convinced he was the killer. Despite his pleas of innocence, he was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison, sent to the Union County Prison Camp. 9 months later, the terror continued. In February 1968, Nancy Carol Paris went missing after taking her dog for a walk. Around the same time, 14-year-old Nancy Christine Reinhardt had also disappeared. Then, in February, Bill Gibbons, the director of the Gaffney Ledger, got a call. Leroy Martin was on the line, claiming he had killed Annie Dedmond, and Roger was not the murderer. He even gave the locations of 2 more bodies and urged Gibbons to check them out with the sheriff. The police found the bodies of Nancy Paris and Nancy Reinhardt, both strangled and molested. Martin wasn't done. He kidnapped 15-year-old Opal Diane Buxton while she was on her way to the school bus stop. Her body was found days later, stabbed and strangled. A manhunt followed. 2 volunteers, Henry Tranzu and Lester Skinner, spotted a car that matched the description given by witnesses. They noted the license plate, leading the police to Martin. He was arrested in February 1968, just days after Buxton's body had been discovered. Martin was charged with 4 murders. Meanwhile, Roger Dedmond, who had been wrongfully imprisoned, was released. During his trial, Martin chose a bench trial instead of a jury, and he was found guilty, receiving 4 life sentences. The sheriff explained that they avoided seeking the death penalty due to concerns about the evidence, fearing Martin might be acquitted. While in prison, Martin confessed to his mother that his dark side had taken over, driving him to kill. But his life ended violently on May 31st, 1972, when another inmate, Kenneth Ramsey, stabbed him to death. Ramsey then took his own life by hanging himself in his cell. Number 6. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Born in 1930, Daniel grew up in Bogotá, Colombia, where he was a bright student at Colegio Salesiano de León XIII. With an IQ of 116, he had a promising future, but financial troubles forced him to quit school in 1958. He soon turned to the streets, where he was first caught for petty theft. His life took a dark turn when he met Esperanza, a woman who became his partner in crime. Together, they lured young girls with false promises, drugged them with sleeping pills, and Daniel assaulted them repeatedly, but he didn't kill them. After the fifth victim, they were arrested, and in April 1964, Daniel was sentenced to 8 years in prison for assault. Once out of prison, Daniel moved to Brazil, but was arrested again in 1973 for being undocumented. Due to delays in transferring his criminal records, he was deported and released under a false identity. Back in Colombia, Daniel posed as a street vendor in Barranquilla selling television monitors. One day he spotted a 9-year-old girl near a school, lured her away, and subjected her to unimaginable horror before strangling her. This was his first known murder. On Christmas Eve in 1977, he was sentenced to 25 years for this crime. In November 1984, after carefully studying ocean currents, Daniel escaped from his island prison and resurfaced in Ecuador. Between 1984 and 1986, he killed at least 54 girls. He preyed on young, poor girls, luring them to remote places, where he strangled or stabbed them if they resisted, then discarded their bodies in the forest. Daniel's killing spree ended on February 26, 1986, when 2 policemen in Quito searched his bag and found bloodied clothes from his latest victim, a 9-year-old girl named Elizabeth. During interrogation, Daniel calmly confessed to killing 72 girls in Ecuador since his escape. He even led authorities to their hidden graves. In 1989, Daniel was sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Ecuadorian law. His life came to a violent end on November 13, 1994, when he was stabbed to death in prison by Giovanni Noguera, the nephew of one of his victims. Daniel was 64 years old. And now, here's our subscriber's pick on dangerous killers who met a brutal end in prison. Take a look at this picture. It shows a prison setting, but the intriguing part is the man in the image. It raises several questions. Is he being held because he's angry and displaying aggressive behavior, or is he being mistreated? We've all heard stories about prison life, where inmates might gang up to beat, humiliate, or even kill someone. It's a constant struggle for dominance within the prison system. We want to hear your thoughts on what might be happening here and your ideas about the man's identity. Join the discussion in the comments section. Number 7. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, began life with an outwardly ordinary start, but early signs of his dark future were evident. As a child, Dahmer was described as shy and withdrawn, showing a disturbing fascination with dead animals. He collected roadkill and dissected it in the woods behind his home, a hobby that was somewhat encouraged by his father, who saw it as a scientific interest. Dahmer's family life was turbulent, with his parents, Lionel and Joyce, frequently arguing and struggling with their own issues. His mother had mental health problems, and his father was often away due to work, leaving Dahmer feeling isolated and neglected. The frequent moves during his childhood added to his sense of instability and loneliness. By his teenage years, Dahmer's behavior grew more troubling. He began drinking heavily and acting out in disturbing ways, engaging in pranks and antics that made others uncomfortable. Despite his attempts to fit in, he struggled with deep-seated feelings of isolation and dark fantasies. His troubling behavior escalated after high school. In 1978, just weeks after graduating, Dahmer committed his first murder at his family home in Bath Township, Ohio. His victim, 18-year-old Stephen Hicks, was lured to Dahmer's home under the pretense of a job interview. Dahmer's gruesome act of dismemberment marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would horrify the world. Dahmer's criminal spree lasted until 1991, during which he committed a series of heinous acts, including necrophilia and cannibalism. His targeting of vulnerable men, often from marginalized communities, and his methodical approach to murder revealed a chilling pattern of opportunistic and grotesque behavior. His reign of terror came to an end on July 22, 1991, when a man escaped from Dahmer's apartment and led police to incriminating evidence. Dahmer was arrested, and his trial, beginning in January 1992, was marked by intense racial tensions due to most of his victims being black. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with a 16th term added later. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was murdered by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, who attacked him with a metal bar. Scarver claimed that God told him to act and was reportedly disturbed by Dahmer's behavior in prison, including shaping his food to resemble body parts. Dahmer died about an hour after the attack, bringing a brutal end to one of history's most notorious killers. Number 8. Roger Kibbe. Roger Kibbe, born on May 21, 1939, would later become infamous as the I-5 Strangler, turning California highways into his personal hunting grounds. Raised in California, Kibbe's early years seemed ordinary, but a dark side was brewing beneath the surface. His path into infamy began in 1977 with the disappearance of Lou Ellen Burley. Burley had met Kibbe under the guise of a job interview, but it was a trap that led to her tragic end. For more than 30 years, her whereabouts were unknown, leaving her family with nothing but unanswered questions and heartbreak. Kibbe's sinister methods were chillingly precise. He would lure his victims, bind them with parachute cords, silence them with duct tape, and cut their clothes before committing his heinous acts. Afterward, he would strangle them, leaving no trace of mercy. But in 1987, his killing spree faced its first real obstacle when he attacked Deborah Ann Guffey. This time, the tables turned. Guffey managed to escape, and her testimony led to Kibbe's arrest. He was sentenced to 8 months behind bars, far less than he deserved. Yet, this arrest would be the turning point that exposed the I-5 Strangler's true horrors. Authorities, armed with Guffey's testimony, began connecting the dots, unraveling the monstrous puzzle of Kibbe's crimes. In 1981, he finally faced justice in court, receiving a sentence of 25 years to life for the murder of 17-year-old Darcy Frackenpole, a runaway whose life was brutally cut short by Kibbe's hands. But even this conviction was just the tip of the iceberg. In 2009, the chilling extent of Kibbe's reign of terror was fully revealed. In a desperate bid to avoid the death penalty, he confessed to the murders of 6 more women. This confession saved him from death row, but resulted in 6 life sentences without the chance of parole. Behind bars, Kibbe's life was unremarkable. He kept to himself, with little interaction with other inmates. However, his end came suddenly and violently. In the early hours of February 28, 2021, at around 12:40 in the morning, a prison officer found Roger Kibbe's lifeless body in his cell. His cellmate, Jason Boudreaux, a 40-year-old self-proclaimed Satanist serving a life sentence for another murder, was responsible. The Amador County Sheriff's Office released an autopsy report on March 3rd, revealing that Kibbe had died from manual strangulation. His life ended in a manner not unlike the way he had ended so many others. Number 9. James Joseph Whitey Bulger. Whitey Bulger's path to becoming one of America's most feared crime lords began in the tough streets of South Boston. Born James Joseph Bulger on September 3, 1929, Bulger was the second of 6 children in a tight-knit Irish-American family. Life was hard. His father lost an arm in an accident and struggled to find work, leaving the family in poverty. Growing up in the gritty projects of Southie, young Bulger quickly earned the nickname Whitey because of his blonde hair, though he preferred to be called Jimmy. From a young age, he showed a rebellious streak, often getting into fights and minor trouble. By his early teens, Bulger had already started building a criminal record, getting into street fights, stealing, and running with small-time gangs. Despite his charm and charisma, he was drawn to the darker side of life, finding excitement in crime and violence. His early run-ins with the law set the stage for a life dominated by crime, as he moved from petty theft to more serious offenses. By the time he was in his 20s, Whitey was a well-known figure in Boston's underworld. After numerous stints in juvenile detention centers, his criminal ambitions grew, and his taste for danger only intensified. In 1956, he landed in prison for hijacking, which saw him doing time in some of the country's toughest prisons, including Alcatraz. Here, he participated in CIA experiments with LSD and other hallucinatory drugs, a desperate move hoping to reduce his sentence. Despite his brush with the horrors of incarceration, prison did little to change Bulger's criminal mindset. When he was released in 1965, he wasted no time returning to his old ways. As Bulger re-entered the world of crime, he aligned himself with the Killeen Gang amidst a violent gang war, where his brutal nature quickly rose to the forefront. His turning point came when he mistakenly killed a man he thought was a rival, setting off a chain of violence that would define his criminal legacy. Switching sides to the Mullen Gang in 1972, Bulger carved his way up the underworld ladder, using ruthless tactics to eliminate anyone who crossed him. By 1979, after the arrest of the Winter Hill Gang's leaders for fixing horse races, Bulger took the reins of the organization, but with a dark secret. Since 1974, he had been an informant for the FBI. Protected by his childhood friend, FBI agent John Connolly, Bulger provided information about the Italian mafia, all while running his own criminal empire. Connolly's protection allowed Bulger to thrive, using murder, extortion, and fear to maintain his stranglehold on Boston's underworld. Bulger's rise continued throughout the 80s, shaking down drug dealers and even supplying weapons to the Irish Republican Army. Yet despite his heavy involvement in crime, he maintained a strict rule against heroin in South Boston, claiming to protect his community even as he destroyed others. But his secret alliance with the FBI couldn't last forever. As law enforcement outside the Bureau began closing in, Connolly warned Bulger of an impending indictment, prompting him to flee in 1994. For 16 years, Bulger remained one of America's most wanted fugitives until 2011, when the FBI finally caught up with him in California. The clever sting involved luring Bulger out of his seaside apartment by telling him his lockbox in the parking area had been tampered with. When he went to check, agents swooped in and arrested him. Even at 81, Bulger tried to maintain control, but his reign of terror was over. On July 6, 2011, Bulger was charged with 48 federal crimes, including 19 murders. In 2013, he was found guilty on 31 charges and sentenced to life in prison, plus 5 more years. After moving between multiple prisons, Bulger's life came to a violent end on October 30th, 2018, in Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia. At 89, confined to a wheelchair, he was brutally beaten to death by fellow inmates using a padlock stuffed in a sock, and his eyes were reportedly gouged out, a fittingly violent end for one of the most feared gangsters in American history. Number 10. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, better known as the Night Stalker, wasn't just a criminal, he was a living nightmare. For 14 relentless months between 1984 and 1985, Southern California was gripped by terror as he unleashed a wave of horror that still haunts the region today. Ramirez didn't just kill, he invaded. He stalked the streets, broke into homes, and left behind nothing but fear and devastation. 13 lives ended brutally, 11 women violated, and countless others forever scarred by his violent spree. Ramirez was the ultimate predator, and his methods were as unpredictable as they were terrifying. There was no pattern, no type, no reason behind his choices. He would slip into homes in the dead of night, turning safe spaces into scenes of unimaginable horror. The weapons of his cruelty were whatever was within reach: guns, knives, or his own hands. The randomness of his attacks made him nearly impossible to catch, as each strike was different from the last. But it wasn't just the violence that terrified people. It was the chilling indifference he showed to human life. In court, Ramirez was the embodiment of evil. He sneered, he taunted, and he flashed a pentagram tattooed on his hand as if to mock those who sought justice. His trial turned into a media circus, with the entire country glued to every shocking detail. Ramirez was not just on trial for his crimes, but for the complete lack of humanity he displayed. August 1985 was the turning point. After months of horror, Ramirez's face was finally recognized by the people of East Los Angeles, who had seen his image plastered across newspapers. When they spotted him wandering their streets, they didn't wait for the police. Fueled by rage, they chased him down, caught him, and held him until officers arrived. In 1989, he was found guilty of a laundry list of crimes, and the death sentence was handed down. Yet, in a final twist of fate, Ramirez avoided execution. He spent years wasting away on death row, his health deteriorating from cancer. On June 7, 2013, the man who had terrorized so many met his end not at the hands of the state, but from a disease that slowly took him down. Ramirez died alone, marking the end of a life defined by terror, cruelty, and a complete absence of remorse.